The War of the Worlds by H.G. Wells, Chapter 1. No one would have believed in the last years of the 19th century that this world was being watched closely by intelligences greater than man's and yet as mortal as his own. While men busied themselves with their various concerns, they were being scrutinized and studied. Oddly, no one on Earth gave a thought to the older worlds of space as sources of human danger. The only thought given them was to dismiss life on any of the other planets as being impossible. Even so, across the gulf of space, intellects vast and unsympathetic regarded Earth with an envious eye. Slowly, they drew their plans against us until early in the 20th century, the Great Disillusionment came. The storm burst upon us 6 years ago. As Mars approached opposition, Lavelle of Java set the wires of the astronomical exchange palpitating with the amazing intelligence of a huge outbreak of incandescent gas upon the planet. This had occurred toward midnight of the 12th. The spectroscope indicated a mass of flaming gas moving with enormous velocity toward Earth. The next day, however, nothing appeared of this in the newspapers. Instead, the world continued in ignorant bliss regarding one of the gravest dangers that had ever threatened the human race. I might not have heard of the eruption at all had I not met Ogilvy, the well-known astronomer, at Ottershaw. He was immensely excited at the news, and in the excess of his feelings, he invited me to take a turn with him that night in scrutinizing the red planet. I remember that vigil distinctly, the black and silent observatory, the shadowed lantern throwing a glow upon the floor in the corner, the steady ticking of the clockwork, the little slit in the roof. As we looked through the telescope, I saw a circle of deep blue and the little round planet swimming in the field. 40 millions of miles it was from us, more than 40 millions of miles of void. Near it in the field, I remember there were 3 faint points of light. They were 3 telescopic stars infinitely remote. All around was the darkness of empty space. Invisible to me because it was so remote and small, flying swiftly and steadily toward me across that incredible distance, it was drawing nearer every minute, that thing they were sending us. The thing that was to bring so much struggle, calamity, and death to Earth. I never dreamed of it then. No one on Earth dreamed of that unerring missile. That night there was another jetting out of gas from the distant planet. A reddish flash at the edge, the slightest projection of the outline just as the chronometer struck midnight. At that, I told Ogilvy, and he took my place. That night, another invisible missile started on its way to Earth from Mars, just a second or so under 24 hours after the first one. I remember how I sat on the table there in the blackness, with patches of green and crimson swimming before my eyes. Ogilvy watched until 1, then he gave it up. Below in the darkness, Ottershaw and Chertsey and all their hundreds of people were sleeping in peace. Ogilvy was filled with speculation that night about the condition of Mars. He scoffed at the idea of its having inhabitants who were signaling us. No one suspected that those missiles the Martians had fired at us were drawing earthward, rushing now at a pace of many miles a second through the empty gulf of space. Chapter 2. Then the night of the first falling star came. Hundreds must have seen it and taken it for an ordinary falling star. I saw nothing of it. Yet this strangest of all things that ever came to Earth from outer space must have fallen while I was sitting there, visible to me had I only looked up as it passed. Very early in the morning, Ogilvy, who had seen the shooting star, and who was persuaded that a meteorite lay somewhere on the common between Horsell, Ottershaw, and Woking, rose early with the idea of finding it. Find it he did, soon after dawn. An enormous hole had been made by the impact of the projectile, and sand and gravel had been flung in every direction over the heath, forming heaps visible a mile and a half away. The heather was on fire eastward, and a thin blue smoke rose against the dawn. The thing itself lay almost entirely buried in sand, amidst the scattered splinters of a fir tree it had shivered to fragments in its descent. The uncovered part had the appearance of a huge cylinder, and its outline was softened by a thick, scaly, dun-colored incrustation with a diameter of about 30 yards. Ogilvy approached the mass, but it was still so hot from its flight as to forbid his near approach. He remained standing at the edge of the pit that the thing had made for itself, dimly perceiving some evidence of design in its arrival. He did not remember hearing any birds that morning. No breeze was stirring. Only sounds from faint movements within the cylinder could be heard. Then Ogilvy noticed that some of the ashy incrustation that covered the meteorite was falling off the circular edge of the end. A large piece suddenly came off and fell with noise so sharp that it brought his heart into his mouth. Although the heat was excessive, Ogilvy clambered down into the pit so as to see the thing more clearly. He fancied even then that the cooling of the body might account for the noise and movement. But what disturbed that idea was the fact that the ash was falling only from the end of the cylinder. Then Ogilvy noticed that the circular top of the cylinder was rotating on its body very slowly. Even then, he scarcely understood what this rotation indicated until he heard a muffled grating sound. Then it happened. The thing came upon him in a flash. Something within the cylinder was unscrewing the top. "Good heavens!" said Ogilvy. "There's a man in it, half roasted to death. He's trying to escape." The thought of the confined creature was so dreadful to him that he forgot the heat and went forward to help turn. Luckily, the dull radiation arrested him before he could burn his hands on the still glowing metal. At that he scrambled out of the pit and set off running wildly into Woking. He met a wagoner and tried to make him understand, but the tale he told was so wild that the man simply drove on. He was equally unsuccessful with the potman, who was just unlocking the doors of the public house by Horshall Bridge. Then he saw Henderson, the London journalist. "Henderson!" he called. "You saw that shooting star last night?" "Well," said Henderson. "It's out on Horsell Common now." "Good Lord," said Henderson. "A fallen meteorite? That's good. But it's something more than a meteorite." "What's that?" he said. Ogilvy told him all that he had seen. Henderson was a minute or so taking in what he was hearing. Then he snatched up his jacket and came out into the road. The two men hurried back to the common and found the cylinder still lying in the same position. But now the sounds inside had ceased, and a thin circle of bright metal showed between the top and the body of the cylinder. They listened, rapped on the scaly burnt metal with a stick, and meeting with no response concluded that the man or men inside must be dead. Since they were unable to do anything, they went back to town again to obtain help. Henderson went into the railway station at once to telegraph the news to London. By 8 o'clock, a number of boys and unemployed men had already started for the common to see the dead men from Mars. That was the form the story took. I heard of it first from my newspaper boy at about 8:45 when I went out to get my daily chronicle. I was naturally startled and lost no time in going back to the sandpits. Chapter 3. I found a little crowd of perhaps 20 people surrounding the huge hole in which the cylinder lay. There was very little talking. Most of the onlookers were staring quietly at the big table-like end of the cylinder, which was still as Ogilvy and Henderson had left it. I clambered into the pit and fancied I heard a faint movement under my feet. It required a certain amount of scientific education to perceive that the gray scale of the thing was no common oxide, that the yellowish-white metal that gleamed in the crack between the lid and the cylinder had an unfamiliar hue. Extraterrestrial had no meaning for most of the onlookers. It was quite clear in my own mind that the thing had come from the planet Mars, but I judged it improbable that it contained any living creature. I thought the unscrewing might be automatic. In spite of Ogilvy, I still believed that there were men on Mars. At about 11 o'clock, since nothing seemed to be happening, I walked back to my home in Maybury. In the afternoon, the appearance of the common had altered very much. The early editions of the evening papers had startled London with enormous headlines. "A message received from Mars." "Remarkable story from Woking." In addition, Ogilvy's wire to the Astronomical Exchange had roused every observatory in the three kingdoms. The burning heather had been extinguished, but the level ground towards Ottershaw was blackened as far as one could see. Going to the edge of the pit, I found it occupied by a group of about half a dozen men. Among them was Henderson, Ogilvy, and a man named Stent, the astronomer royal, along with several workmen who were wielding spades and pickaxes. A large portion of the cylinder had been uncovered, though its lower end was still embedded. As soon as Ogilvy saw me among the staring crowd on the edge of the pit, he called to me to come down. He asked if I would go to see Lord Hilton, the lord of the manor. The growing crowd had become a serious impediment to the attempted excavations. The men working wanted help keeping people back from the scene. I failed to find Lord Hilton at his house, but I was told that he was expected from London by the 6 o'clock train, so I walked up to the station to waylay him. Chapter 4. When I returned to the common, the sun was setting. The crowd about the pit had increased to a couple of hundred people. I heard raised voices, and some sort of struggle appeared to be going on about the pit. As I drew nearer, I heard Stent's voice. "Keep back! Keep back!" I went on to the crowd and elbowed my way through. "I say," said Ogilvy, "help keep these idiots back." The end of the cylinder was being screwed out from within. Nearly 2 feet of shining screw projected. I turned, and as I did so, the screw must have come out, for the lid of the cylinder fell upon the gravel with a ringing concussion. I think everyone expected to see a man emerge, possibly a being a little unlike us, more like a terrestrial man, but in all essentials a man. But upon looking more closely, I saw something stirring within the shadow with grayish, billowy movements, and then 2 luminous discs that looked like eyes. Then something that resembled a little gray snake that was about the thickness of a walking stick coiled up out of the writhing middle and wriggled in the air toward me, and then toward another. I half turned, keeping my eyes fixed upon the cylinder still. Other tentacles were now projecting from it as I began pushing my way back from the edge of the pit. Astonishment was giving way to horror on the faces of the peoples about me as they generally moved backward. Suddenly, I found myself alone and saw people on the other side of the pit running away. I looked again at the cylinder, and an ungovernable terror gripped me. Those who have never seen a living Martian can scarcely imagine the strange horror of its appearance or its peculiar V-shaped mouth with its pointed upper lip, the incessant quivering of its mouth, the Gorgon groups of tentacles, the tumultuous breathing of the lungs in what, to it, is our strange atmosphere. Above all, the extraordinary intensity of the immense eyes, that were at once vital, inhuman, crippled, and monstrous, would be shocking. Something in the oily brown skin seemed fungoid in nature. Then there was the clumsy deliberations of the tedious movements. They seemed unspeakably nasty. Even at this first encounter, I was overcome with dread and disgust. Suddenly the monster toppled over the rim of the cylinder and fell into the pit with a thud. It gave out a cry, and then another of these creatures appeared darkly in the deep shadow of the aperture. I turned and ran madly for the first group of trees. They were perhaps 100 yards away at the time. There I stopped. The common round the sandpits was dotted with people, standing like me in a half-fascinated terror, staring at these creatures. Chapter 5. After my glimpse of the Martians emerging from the cylinder, a kind of fascination paralyzed my actions. My very being was a battleground of fear and curiosity. Most of the spectators had gathered in 1 or 2 groups. Evidently, they shared my own mental conflict. Finally, as the sunset faded to twilight, the crowd far away on the left, toward Woking, seemed to grow. Shortly thereafter, I heard a faint murmur arise from it. Then the small knot of people toward Chobham began to disperse. As dusk came on, a slow, intermittent movement upon the sandpits began. Vertical black figures in 2s and 3s would advance, stop, watch, and advance again. They spread out as they did so in a thin, irregular crescent that promised to enclose the pit. I, too, on my side, began to move towards the pit. Then I saw that some cabmen and others had walked boldly into the sandpits. Within 30 yards of the pit, I noticed a small black knot of men, the foremost of whom was waving a white flag. A hasty consultation of onlookers had resolved to show the Martians, who were evidently intelligent creatures, that we Earthlings were intelligent also. I was too far removed to recognize anyone there. Afterwards, however, I learned that Ogilvy, Stent, and Henderson had been among the group of others who had decided to attempt this communication. The little group had, in its advance, dragged inward the circumference of the now almost complete circle of people. Suddenly a flash of light illuminated the immediate area, and a quantity of luminous greenish smoke arose from the pit. At the same time a faint hissing sound became audible. Then slowly the hissing passed into a long, loud, droning noise. Slowly a humped shape came up out of the pit, and a beam of light seemed to flicker out from it. Forthwith, flashes of actual flame sprang from the scattered group of men. It was as if each man were suddenly and momentarily turned to fire. Then, by the light of their own destruction, I saw them staggering and falling, and their supporters turning to run. As the unseen shaft of heat passed over them, pine trees caught fire, and every dry bush became one dull thud, then a mass of flames. This invisible sword of heat was sweeping round swiftly and steadily. Then, as if an invisible yet intensely heated finger had drawn a line through the heather between me and the Martians, and all along a curving line beyond the sandpits, the dark ground smoked and crackled. Forthwith the hissing and humming ceased, and the black dome-like object sank slowly out of sight and back into the pit. All this had happened with such swiftness that I stood motionless, dazzled by the flashes of light. If that death had swept through a full circle, it would surely have slain me in my surprise. The undulating common seemed now dark almost to blackness, except where its roadways lay gray and pale beneath the deep blue sky of the early night. Patches of bush and isolated trees here and there smoked and glowed still, and the houses towards Woking Station were sending up spires of flame into the stillness of the evening air. Nothing was changed, save for that and a terrible astonishment. It came to me that I was upon this dark common, helpless and alone. Suddenly, fear came upon me like a thing falling upon me from without. With decided effort, I turned and began a stumbling run through the heather. The fear I felt was no rational fear. It was rather a panic terror. Once I had turned, I did not dare to look back. Chapter 6. I remember nothing of my flight except the stress of blundering against trees and stumbling through the heather. I came into the road between the crossroads and Horsell and ran along this to the crossroads. At last I could go no further. I was exhausted with the violence of my emotion and my flight, and I staggered and fell by the wayside. I must have remained there for some time. I sat up, strangely perplexed. For a moment I could not understand how I came to be there. My terror had fallen from me like a garment. Both the impulse of my flight and the starting flames seemed as if they had almost been a dream. I rose and walked unsteadily up the steep incline of the bridge. My muscles and nerves seemed drained of their strength. A head rose over the arch, and the figure of a workman carrying a basket appeared. Beside him ran a little boy. He passed me, wishing me good night. I answered his greeting with a meaningless mumble and continued on over the bridge. A dim group of people talked at the gate of a house in the pretty little row of gables. The scene was so real and familiar. The scene behind me, frantic and fantastic. There was a noise of busyness from the gasworks, and the electric lamps were all alight. I asked myself, had these things indeed happened? I could not credit it. Then I gathered myself together as best I could and went home. Chapter 7. In London that night, poor Henderson's telegram describing the gradual unscrewing of the shot was judged to be a canard, and his evening paper, after wiring for authentication from him and receiving no reply, decided not to print a special edition. Maybe there was a murmur in the village streets, and here and there a messenger, or even an eyewitness of the later occurrences, caused a whirl of excitement. But for the most part, the daily routine went on as it had done for countless years. It was only round the edge of the common that any disturbance was perceptible. So you have the state of things on Friday night. In the center, the cylinder was sticking into the skin of our old planet Earth like a poisoned dart, but the poison was scarcely working yet. In the rest of the world, the stream of life still flowed as it had flowed for immemorable years. The fever of war had still to develop. All night long the Martians were hammering and stirring, at work on the machines they were making ready. Ever and again a puff of greenish-white smoke whirled up. At about 11 o'clock, a company of soldiers came through Horsell and deployed along the edge of the common to form a cordon. Later, a second company marched through Chobham to deploy on the north side of the common. The next morning's papers were able to say a squadron of hussars, 2 Maxims, and about 400 men of the Cardigan Regiment had been sent from Aldershot. A few seconds after midnight, a star fell from heaven into the pine woods to the northwest. The falling star, it was said, had given off a greenish color and had caused a silent brightness like summer lightning. This was the second cylinder. Chapter 8. Saturday lives in my memory as a day of suspense. After breakfast, I decided to walk down toward the common. Under the railway bridge, I found a group of soldiers who told me that no one was allowed over the canal. I did not succeed in getting a glimpse of the common, for even Horsell and Chobham church towers were in the hands of the military authorities. I found people in the town quite secure again in the presence of the military. The soldiers had made the people on the outskirts of Horsell lock up and leave their houses. The Martians did not show an inch of themselves. They seemed busy in their pit, and there was a sound of hammering and an almost continuous streamer of smoke. About 3 o'clock, the thud of a gun at measured intervals began to be heard from Chertsey or Addlestone. I learned that the smoldering pine wood into which the second cylinder had fallen was still shelled in the hope of destroying the object before it opened. At about 5 o'clock, a field gun reached Chobham for use against the first body of Martians. About 6 o'clock in the evening, I heard a muffled detonation from the common, and immediately after a gust of firing. Close on the heels of that came a violent rattling crash that shook the ground. I saw the tops of the trees about the Oriental College burst into smoky red flame. The tower of the little church beside it slid down into ruin. Down the hill I saw a bevy of hussars ride under the railway bridge. 3 galloped through the open gates of the Oriental College. 2 others dismounted and began running from house to house. Soon after, a soldier came running up. He was going from house to house, warning people to leave. I shouted after him, "What news?" He bawled something about crawling out in a thing like a dish cover. Then he ran on to the next house. A sudden whirl of black smoke drifted across the road, hiding him for a moment. Thick streamers of black smoke, shot with threads of red fire, were driving up into the still air and throwing dark shadows upon the green treetops to the east. The smoke already extended to the Byfleet pine woods eastward and to Woking on the west. The road was dotted with people running toward me. And very faint now, but very distinctly, one heard the whir of a machine gun that was presently stilled, as well as an intermittent cracking of rifle fire. Apparently the Martians were setting fire to everything within range of their heat ray. I ran down and hid in the cellar, hoping to remain hidden and escape the fire as before. Chapter 9. I was completely unaware how the evening's fighting had progressed. I did not know even the circumstances that had precipitated the conflict. When I at last ascended from the cellar, I closed the door noiselessly and crept toward the window. The view opened out until it reached to the houses about Woking Station. On the other I could see the charred and blackened pine woods of Byfleet. Several houses along Maybury Road and the streets near the station were nothing short of glowing ruins. The light upon the railway puzzled me at first. Then I perceived this was a wrecked train. The forepart was smashed and on fire. The hinder carriages were still upon the rails. Between these 3 main centers of light, the houses, the train, and the burning county toward Chobham, stretched irregular patches of dark country, broken here and there by intervals of dimly glowing, smoking ground. At first I could distinguish no people at all, though I peered intently for them. Later I saw against the light of Woking Station a number of black figures hurrying one after the other across the line. I still did not know what had happened in the last 7 hours. I also did not know the relation between these mechanical colossi and the sluggish lumps I had seen disgorged from the cylinder. I turned my desk chair to the window, sat down, and stared at the blackened country, and particularly at 3 gigantic black things that were going to and fro in the glare about the sandpits. They seemed amazingly busy. Were they intelligent mechanisms? Such a thing I felt was impossible. Or did a Martian sit within each, ruling and directing, much as a man's brain sits and rules in his body? Over the smoke of the burning land, the little fading pinpoint of Mars was dropping into the west, when a soldier came into my garden. I heard a slight scraping at the fence, and I looked down and saw him dimly clambering over the palings. At the sight of another human being, my torpor passed, and I leaned out of the window eagerly. "Hist!" said I in a whisper. He stopped astride of the fence in doubt. Then he came over and across the lawn to the corner of the house. He bent down and stepped softly. "Who's there?" he said, also whispering. "Where are you going?" I asked. "God knows." "Are you trying to hide?" "That's it." "Come into the house," I said. I went down, unfastened the door, let him in, and locked the door again. "My God," he said, as I drew him in. "What has happened?" I asked. "What hasn't? They wiped us out. Simply wiped us out," he repeated again and again. He followed me almost mechanically into the dining room. "Take some whiskey," I said, pouring out a stiff dose. He drank it. Then abruptly he sat down before the table and began to weep like a little boy in a perfect passion of emotion. It was a long time before he could answer my questions. He was a driver in the artillery and had only come into action at about 7 o'clock. At that time firing was going on across the common, and it was said the first party of Martians were crawling slowly toward their second cylinder under cover of a metal shield. Later, this shield staggered up on tripod legs and became the first of the fighting machines I had seen. The gun he drove had been unlimbered near Horsell to command the sandpits. It was its arrival that had precipitated the action. As the limber gunners went to the rear, his horse trod in a rabbit hole and came down, throwing him into a depression of the ground. At the same moment the gun had exploded behind him, the ammunition had blown up. There was fire all about him, and he found himself lying under a heap of charred dead men and dead horses. "I lay still," he said, "scared out of my wits. We'd been wiped out. I was hurt across the back by the fall of a horse, and there I had to lie until I felt better. It had been just like a parade a minute before, then stumble, bang, swish." "Wiped out," he said. He had hid under a dead horse for a long time, peeping out furtively across the common. The Cardigan men had tried a rush, in skirmishing order, at the pit simply to be swept out of existence. Then the monster had risen to its feet and had begun to walk to and fro across the common among the few fugitives, with its head-like hood turning about exactly like the head of a cowled human being. A kind of arm carried a complicated metallic case. Green flashes scintillated about it, and out of the funnel of this there smoked the heat ray. He heard the Martians rattle for a time and then become still. The giant saved Woking Station and its cluster of houses until the last. Then in a moment the heat ray was brought to bear, and the town became a heap of fiery ruins. Then the thing shut off the heat ray and began to waddle away toward the smoldering pine woods that sheltered the second cylinder. As it did so, a second glittering titan built itself up out of the pit. The second monster followed the first, and at that the artilleryman began to crawl very cautiously across the hot heather ash towards Horsell. He managed to get alive into the ditch by the side of the road, and so escaped to Woking. It seemed there were a few people alive there, frantic for the most part, and many burned and scalded. He was turned aside by the fire and hid among some almost scorching heaps of broken wall as one of the Martian giants returned. At last, after nightfall, the artilleryman made a rush for the railway embankment and got over it. Since then he had been skulking along toward Maybury in the hope of getting out of danger Londonward. He had eaten no food since midday, and so I found some mutton and bread in the pantry and brought it out into the room. As he talked, I began to see his face, blackened and haggard, as mine also no doubt was. When he had finished eating, we went softly upstairs to my study. I looked again out of the open window. Countless ruins of shattered and gutted houses and blasted and blackened trees that the night had hidden now stood out gaunt and terrible in the pitiless light of dawn. Shining with the growing light of the east, 3 of the metallic giants stood about the pit, their cowls rotating as though they were surveying the desolation they had made. Chapter 10. As the dawn grew brighter, we slipped quietly down the stairs. The artilleryman proposed, he said, to make his way Londonward and thence rejoin his battery. I, on the other hand, planned to make my way to Leatherhead, to where my family lived. Once there, I decided that my family and I would make our way out of the county forthwith. I already perceived clearly that the country about London would inevitably be the scene of a disastrous struggle before such creatures as these could be destroyed. Between us and Leatherhead lay the third cylinder. Had I been alone, I think I should have taken my chance and struck out across country. But the artilleryman dissuaded me, and in the end I agreed to go with him under cover of the woods, northward as far as Street Cobham, before I parted with him. After that, I intended to make a big detour by Epsom to reach Leatherhead. I should have started at once, but he made me ransack the house for a flask, which he filled with whiskey. We lined every available pocket with packets of biscuits and slices of meat. Then we crept out of the house and ran as quickly as we could. Save ourselves, not another living soul seemed to exist anywhere on Maybury Hill. We went down the lane and broke into the woods at the foot of the hill. The woods across the line were but the scarred and blackened ruins of woods. Everything was strangely still. Even the birds were hushed. As we hurried along, I and the artilleryman talked in whispers. Once or twice we stopped to listen. By Byfleet Station, we emerged from the pine trees and found the country calm and peaceful under the morning sunlight. We were far beyond the range of the heat ray there, and had it not been for the stirring movement of packing in some houses and the knot of soldiers standing on the bridge staring toward Woking, the day would have seemed very like any other Sunday. Across a stretch of flat meadow, we saw 6 12-pounders standing neatly at equal distances, pointing toward Woking. The gunners stood by the guns waiting, and the ammunition wagons were at a business-like distance. Farther on, toward Weybridge, just over the bridge, a number of men in white fatigue jackets were throwing up a long rampart and more guns behind. "It's bows and arrows against the lightning, anyhow," said the artilleryman. "They haven't seen that fire beam yet." Byfleet was in a tumult. People were packing and trying to get away quickly. No one in Weybridge could tell us where the headquarters were established. The whole place was in such confusion as I had never seen in any town before. I and the artilleryman seated on the step of the drinking fountain made a very passable meal upon which we had brought with us. Patrols of soldiers were warning people to move now or to take refuge in their cellars as soon as the firing began. Across the Thames, except just where the boats landed, everything was quiet, in vivid contrast with the Surrey side. The people who landed there from the boats were tramping off down the lane. The big ferry boat had just made a journey. 3 or 4 soldiers stood on the lawn of the inn, staring and jesting at the fugitives, without offering to help. "What's that?" cried a boatman. Then the sound came again, this time from the direction of Chertsey. Almost immediately, unseen batteries across the river to our right took up the chorus, firing heavily one after the other. Everyone stood arrested by the sudden stir of battle. Nothing was to be seen save flat meadows, cows feeding unconcernedly for the most part. Then suddenly we saw a rush of smoke far away up the river. Forthwith the ground heaved underfoot, and a heavy explosion shook the air. "Here they are!" shouted a man. "Yonder! Do you see them?" Quickly 4 of the armored Martians appeared across the flat meadows that stretched toward Chertsey. They were striding toward the river. A 5th group of Martians advanced obliquely toward us, their armored bodies glittering in the sun as they swept swiftly forward upon the guns. At sight of these swift and terrible creatures, the crowd near the water's edge seemed to me to be for a moment horror-struck. Rather than screaming or shouting, they stood in utter silence. But I was not too terrified for thought. The terrible heat ray was in my mind. "Get under water!" I shouted. I faced about again and rushed toward the approaching Martian, rushed right down the gravelly beach and headlong into the water. Others did the same. Then, as the Martian towered overhead, scarcely a couple of 100 yards away, I flung myself forward under the surface. The splashes of the people in the boats leaping into the river sounded like thunderclaps in my ears. When, half suffocated, I raised my head above water, the Martian's hood pointed at the batteries that were still firing across the river. As it advanced, it swung loose what must have been the generator of the heat ray. In another moment it was on the bank, and in a stride it was wading halfway across. Then it had raised itself to its full height again. Forthwith the 6 guns, which had been hidden behind the outskirts of the village, fired simultaneously. The sudden near concussion made my heart jump. The monster was already raising the case, generating the heat ray, as the first shell burst 6 yards above the hood. I saw and thought nothing of the other 4 Martian monsters. My attention was riveted upon the nearer incident. Simultaneously, 2 other shells burst in the air near the body as the hood twisted round in time to receive, but not in time to dodge the 4th shell. The shell burst clean in the face of the thing. The hood bulged, flashed, and then whirred off in a dozen tattered fragments. The decapitated colossus reeled like a drunken giant. But it did not fall over. Instead, it recovered its balance. No longer heeding its steps, with the camera that fired the heat ray now rigidly upheld, it reeled swiftly upon Shepperton. The Martian within the hood was slain, and the thing was now but a mere intricate device of metal whirling to destruction. It drove along in a straight line, incapable of guidance. It struck the tower of Shepperton Church, smashing it down, swerved aside, blundered on, and collapsed with tremendous force into the river. A violent explosion shook the air, and a spout of water, steam, mud, and shattered metal shot far up into the sky. As the camera of the heat ray hit the water, the latter immediately flashed into steam. In another moment, a huge wave, like a muddy tidal, came sweeping round the bend upstream. I splashed through the tumultuous water until I could see round the bend. The fallen Martian came into sight downstream, lying across the river, and for the most part submerged. My attention was diverted by a furious yelling. A man, knee-deep near the towing path, shouted inaudibly to me and pointed. Looking back, I saw the other Martians advancing with gigantic strides down the riverbank from the direction of Chertsey. At that I ducked at once under water, and, holding my breath until movement was an agony, blundered painfully ahead under the surface as long as I could. The water was in a tumult about me and rapidly growing hotter. When for a moment I raised my head to take breath, the steam was rising in a whirling white fog that at first hid the Martians altogether. The noise was deafening. Then I saw them dimly, colossal figures of gray, magnified by the mist. They had passed by me. 2 were stooping over the frothing, tumultuous ruins of their comrade. The 3rd and 4th stood beside him in the water, one perhaps 200 yards from me. The generators of the heat rays waved high. The hissing beams smote down this way and that. The air was full of sound, the clangorous din of the Martians, the crash of falling houses, the thud of trees, fences flashing into flame, and the crackling and roaring of fire. For a moment, perhaps, I stood there, breast high in the almost boiling water, dumbfounded at my position, hopeless of escape. Through the reek I could see people who had been with me in the river scrambling out of the water through the reeds, running to and fro in utter dismay on the towing path. Then suddenly the white flashes of the heat ray came leaping toward me. The houses caved in as they dissolved at its touch. The trees changed to fire with a roar. The ray flickered up and down the towing path and came down to the water's edge not 50 yards from where I stood. I turned shoreward. In another moment a huge wave, well nigh at the boiling point, had rushed upon me. I screamed aloud. Scalded and half blinded, I staggered through the hissing water toward shore. I fell helplessly upon the broad, bare, gravelly spit that runs down to Thames. Chapter 12. After getting this sudden lesson in the power of terrestrial weapons, the Martians retreated to their original position upon Horsell Common. In their haste, and encumbered with the debris of their smashed companion, they no doubt overlooked many such a stray and negligible victim as myself. Cylinder followed cylinder on its interplanetary flight. Every 24 hours brought more reinforcements. Meanwhile, the military and naval authorities, now fully alive to the tremendous power of their antagonists, worked with furious energy. It would seem that these giants spent the earlier part of the afternoon going to and fro, transferring everything from the second and third cylinders to their original pit on Horsell Common. Over that stood one sentinel. The rest had abandoned their vast fighting machines and had descended into the pit. While the Martians behind me were preparing for their next sally, in front of me humanity gathered for the battle. I made my way with infinite pain and labor from the fire and smoke of burning Weybridge toward London. I saw an abandoned boat, very small and remote, drifting downstream. I went after it, gained it, and escaped out of that destruction. I made my way down the river toward Halliford and Walton. For a long time I drifted, painful and weary after the violence I had been through. The heat upon the water was intense. At last I saw the bridge at Walton coming into sight, and I landed on the Middlesex bank. I walked perhaps half a mile without meeting a soul. Then I lay down in the shadow of a hedge, utterly exhausted, and slept. I awoke to the dull resonance of distant guns and a remote, weird crying. Then everything was still. High in the west, the crescent moon hung faint and pale above the smoke of Weybridge and Shepperton. I decided to head northward. Chapter 13. The London papers on Saturday contained a brief, vaguely worded telegram. The Martians had killed a number of people with a quick-firing gun, so the story ran. The telegram concluded with the words, "Formidable as they seem to be, the Martians have not moved from the pit into which they have fallen, and indeed seem incapable of doing so." The afternoon papers puffed scraps of news under big headlines. They had nothing to tell beyond the movements of troops about the common and the burning of the pine woods between Woking and Weybridge. No one in London knew the nature of the armored Martians. None of the telegrams could have been written by an eyewitness of their advance. The Sunday papers printed separate editions as further news came to hand. Even so, there was practically nothing more to tell people until late in the afternoon, when the authorities gave the press agencies the news in their possession. It was stated that the people of Walton and Weybridge and the district were pouring along the roads Londonward, and that was all. At about 5 o'clock, the gathering crowd in the station was immensely excited by the opening of the line of communication which is almost invariably closed between the southeastern and the southwestern stations. They were especially excited by the passage of carriage trucks bearing huge guns and carriages crammed with soldiers. A little while after that, a squad of police came into the station and began to clear the public off the platforms. On the bridge, a number of loafers were watching a curious brown scum that came drifting down the stream in patches. The sun was just setting, and the clock tower and the Houses of Parliament rose against one of the most peaceful skies it is possible to imagine. The Martians had been repulsed. They were not invulnerable, people began to think. After all, they had retreated to their triangle of cylinders again in the circle about Woking. Signalers with heliographs were pushing forward upon them from all sides. Guns were in rapid transit from Windsor, Portsmouth, Aldershot, and Woolwich, even from the north. Among others, long wire guns of 95 tons from Woolwich. Altogether, 116 were in position or were being hastily placed, chiefly to cover London. The authorities had reason to suppose, from the size of the cylinders, that at the outside there could not be more than 5 in each cylinder, 15 altogether. One at least was disposed of, perhaps more. The public would be fairly warned of the approach of danger. And so, with reiterated assurances of the safety of London and the ability of the authorities to cope with the difficulty, this quasi-proclamation closed. All down Wellington Street, people could be seen fluttering out the pink sheets and reading, and the Strand was suddenly noisy with the voices of an army of hawkers following these pioneers. Men came scrambling off buses to secure copies. Certainly this news excited people intensely, whatever their previous apathy. Then news arrived revealing that Woking had been entirely destroyed on the previous night. About 8 o'clock, a noise of heavy firing was distinctly audible all over the south of London. There were 1 or 2 cartloads of refugees passing along Oxford Street, and several in the Marylebone Road. But so slowly was the news spreading that Regent Street and Portland Place were full of their usual Sunday night promenaders, albeit they talked in groups. Along the edge of Regent's Park, as many silent couples were walking out together under the scattered gas lamps as ever there had ever been. The night was warm and still, and a little oppressive. The sound of guns continued intermittently, and after midnight there seemed to be sheet lightning in the south. Early that next morning, the sound of drumming and trumpeting came from the Albany Street barracks. Every church within earshot was hard at work killing sleep with a vehement disorderly tocsin. There was a noise of doors opening. Window after window in the houses opposite flashed from darkness into yellow illumination. Upon the street came galloping a closed carriage, bursting abruptly into noise at the corner, rising to a clattering climax under the window, and dying away slowly in the distance. Close on the rear of this came a couple of cabs, the forerunners of a long procession of flying vehicles, going for the most part to Chalk Farm Station, where the Northwestern special trains were loading up. Presently, men selling unnaturally early newspapers came bawling into the street. "London was in danger of suffocation! Fearful massacres in the Thames Valley!" London, which had gone to bed on Sunday night oblivious and inert, was awakened, in the small hours of Monday morning, to a vivid sense of danger. The whole population of the great 6-million-peopled city was now stirring. Presently it would be pouring en masse north. Chapter 14. As far as one could ascertain, despite the conflicting accounts that had been put forth, the majority of the Martians had remained busy with preparations in the Horsell Pit until 9 o'clock that night. 3, however, it was said, came out at about 8 o'clock and made their way through Byfleet and Pireford toward Ripley and Weybridge. They came in sight of the expectant batteries against the setting sun. These Martians did not advance in a body, but rather in a line, each perhaps a mile and a half from his nearest fellow. The Ripley gunners fired one wild, premature, ineffectual volley. Then they bolted either on horse or foot through the deserted village, while the Martian walked serenely over their guns, stepped gingerly among them, and unexpectedly came upon the guns in Painshill Park. The Martians, of course, promptly destroyed those guns. The St. George's Hill men, however, were better led or of a better mettle than the Ripley gunners. They laid their guns as deliberately as if they had been on parade and fired at about 1,000 yards range. The shells flashed all round him, and he was seen to advance a few paces, stagger, and go down. Immediately, a second glittering giant appeared over the trees to the south. The whole of the second volley flew wide of the Martian on the ground. Simultaneously, both his companions brought their heat rays to bear on the battery. After this, the 3 seemed to take counsel together. They remained stationary for about half an hour. The Martian who had been overthrown crawled tediously out of his hood and apparently engaged in the repair of his support. It was a few minutes past 9 o'clock that night when these 3 sentinels were joined by 4 other Martians, each carrying a thick black tube. A similar tube was handed to each of the 3. The 7 then proceeded to distribute themselves at equal distances along a curved line between St. George's Hill, Weybridge, and the village of Send. A dozen rockets sprang out of the hills before them as soon as they moved, warning the waiting batteries about Ditton and Esher. At the same time, 4 of their fighting machines, similarly armed with tubes, crossed the river. 2 of them came into my sight as I hurried, wearily and painfully, along the road that runs northward out of Halliford. I turned aside. As I crawled through dewy nettles and brambles into the broad ditch by the side of the road, the 2 halted. The one nearer to me stood facing Sunbury. The more remote one was a mere gray indistinctness toward the evening star, away toward Staines. The Martians' occasional howling had ceased. They had taken up their positions in the huge crescent about their cylinders. They remained absolutely silent. Even so, wherever a cluster of trees or village houses provided sufficient cover, guns were waiting, facing the Martian crescent. Signal rockets burst in the sky, occasionally raining their sparks through the night briefly before vanishing. The spirit of all those watching the batteries rose to a level of tense expectation. The Martians had but to advance into the line of fire, and instantly those motionless black forms of men, those guns glittering so darkly in the early night, would explode into a thunderous fury of battle. After an interminable time, a sound similar to the distant concussion of a gun was heard. Then another nearer was heard, then another. The Martian beside me raised his tube on high and discharged it with a heavy report that made the ground heave. The one towards Staines answered him. I clambered up into the hedge and stared toward Sunbury. As I did, a second report followed. A large projectile hurtled overhead toward Hounslow. All I saw was the deep blue sky above, with one solitary star and a white mist spreading wide and low beneath. There was no crash, no answering explosion. I looked again at the Martian and saw that he was now moving eastward along the riverbank with a swift rolling motion. Every moment I expected the fire of some hidden battery to spring upon him, but the evening calm remained unbroken. The land lay dark in appearance toward Sunbury, as though a conical hill had suddenly come into being there, hiding my view of the farther country. Then, toward Walton, which was farther away across the river, I saw another such summit. I looked northward. There I perceived that yet a third of these cloudy black copies had risen. Everything had suddenly become very still. Far away to the southeast, marking the quiet, I heard the Martians hooting to one another. Then the air quivered again with the distant thud of their guns. Once again the earthly artillery made no reply. Later I learned that each of the Martians had discharged a huge canister over whatever hill, copse, or cluster of houses chanced to be in front of him. These canisters smashed upon striking the ground, and incontinently disengaged an enormous volume of heavy, inky vapor that coiled and poured upward in a huge ebony cumulus cloud. This became a gaseous hill that sank and spread itself slowly over the surrounding country. At last the fourth cylinder fell in Bushy Park, becoming a brilliant green meteor. Working methodically, the Martians had spread this strange, stifling vapor over the Londonward countryside. All night through, their destructive tubes had advanced. Never once, after the Martian at St. George's Hill was brought down, did they give the artillery a ghost of a chance against them. Sunday night was the end of the organized opposition to their movements. After that, no body of men would stand against them. To do so, all knew, would be a hopeless enterprise. Before dawn, the black vapor was pouring through the streets of Richmond, and the disintegrating organism of government was rousing the population of London, informing them of the need to flee. Chapter 15. The stream of fleeing humans rose swiftly to a torrent, as all who could began to hurry by every available channel northward and eastward. By 10 o'clock, the police organization, and then by midday, even the railway organizations, were losing coherency, shape, and efficiency. Each organization began to gutter, soften, and run at last in that swift liquefaction of the social body. All the railway lines north of the Thames and the southeastern people at Cannon Street had been warned by midnight on Sunday, and trains were being filled. People were fighting savagely for standing room in the carriages, even at 2 o'clock. By 3 o'clock, people were being trampled and crushed. Revolvers were fired, and people were stabbed. By midday, a Martian had been seen at Barnes, and a cloud of slowly sinking black vapor drove along the Thames and across the flats of Lambeth, cutting off all escape over the bridges in its sluggish advance. If one could have hung in a balloon above London on that June morning, every northward and eastward road would have seemed stippled black with the streaming fugitives. It was the beginning of the rout of civilization, of the massacre of humankind. Over the blue hills that rise southward of the river, the glittering Martians went to and fro, calmly and methodically spreading their poisonous cloud. They did not seem determined to exterminate so much as they intended to completely demoralize and destroy any opposition. Of the falling of the fifth cylinder, I will presently tell. The sixth star fell at Wimbledon. Chapter 16. Somehow I found my way to an empty house in Halliford, where I fled to escape the black smoke. I remained there all Sunday night, and all the next day. I could do nothing but wait in aching inactivity during those 2 weary days. I was hopelessly hemmed in by the black smoke all that day and the morning of the next. When at last I crept to a window, the country northward looked as though a black snowstorm had passed over it. When the smoke finally dissipated, I sought out food and drink. I then started along the blackened road to Sunbury. In Sunbury I saw several dead bodies, horses as well as men, overturned carts and luggage, all covered thickly with black dust. At length I came to Twickenham. Twickenham was uninjured by either heat ray or black smoke, and more people were moving about in Twickenham. I hurried across Richmond Bridge, where I noticed a number of red masses floating down the stream. Then suddenly, as I approached Kew, the upper works of a Martian fighting machine loomed in sight over the housetops, not 100 yards from me. I turned aside and hid in a shed. I suppose it was nearly 11 o'clock before I gathered enough courage to start out again. I no longer ventured into the road. Instead, I chose to sneak about along the hedgerows and through plantations. Soon I arrived at Sheen, where I made my way into one of the empty houses. There I found a store of food in the pantry. I sat quietly in the darkened kitchen, eating bread and ham. It must have been near midnight when a glare of vivid green light appeared. Immediately after the glare, I felt such a concussion as I had never heard before or since. Then glass began to crash and rattle. Masonry fell all about me, and the plaster of the ceiling came down upon me. For some time I could not recollect what had happened. Then things came to me slowly. I even noticed a bruise on my temple begin to assert itself. Everything seemed deadly still. Outside and very near, an intermittent metallic rattle could be heard. It was not like the heat ray, but for a time I thought one of the great fighting machines had stumbled against the house. For 3 or 4 hours, until the dawn came, I scarcely moved. Then some light filtered in through a triangular aperture between a beam and a heap of broken bricks in the wall behind me. I now saw the interior of the kitchen for the first time. The window had been burst in by a mass of garden mold which flowed over the table and lay about my feet. Outside, the soil was banked high against the house. The floor was littered with smashed hardware. The end of the kitchen towards the house was broken into, and it was evident that the greater part of the house had collapsed. As dawn grew clearer, I saw through the gap in the wall the body of a Martian, standing sentinel over the still glowing cylinder. At the sight of the Martian, I crawled as quietly as possible into the darkness of the scullery. Abruptly, the right interpretation dawned upon my mind. "The 5th cylinder," I whispered to myself. I scarce dared breathe. I sat with my eyes fixed on the faint light of the kitchen door. Outside, a metallic hammering began. Then a violent hooting was heard, followed a hissing like the hissing of an engine. Presently, a measured thudding and vibration made everything about me begin to quiver. I must have crouched there, silent and shivering, for many hours until my tired attention failed me. When I did come to myself, my hunger was so insistent that it moved me to action. I felt my way toward the pantry. Chapter 17. After eating, I crept back to the scullery. There I must have dozed again, despite the wearisome persistence of the thudding vibration that continued. I noticed a number of noises, almost like those in an engine shed. The place actually rocked with that continuing beating thud. Through the aperture in the wall, I could see the top of a tree touched with gold. I could also make out the warm blue of a tranquil evening sky. Even so, the 5th cylinder lay deep in a hole, vastly larger than the pit I had looked into at Woking. The house had collapsed backward. The front portion, even on the ground floor, had been destroyed completely. By chance, the kitchen and scullery had escaped destruction and stood buried now under soil and ruins, closed in by tons of earth on every side save toward the cylinder. The cylinder was already opened in the center of the pit. On the farther side of the pit, one of the great fighting machines had been deserted by its occupant. It stood stiff and tall against the evening sky. The mechanism held my attention first. Most of its arms were retracted, but with 3 long tentacles it was fishing out a number of rods, plates, and bars which lined the covering and apparently strengthened the cylinder's walls. These, as it extracted them, were lifted out and deposited upon a level surface of earth behind it. Its motion was swift, complex, and perfect. Very soon, the busy handling machine had put together several of the apparatus pieces. It had taken them out of the cylinder into a shape having an unmistakable likeness to its own. Down on the left, a busy little digging mechanism had come into view, emitting jets of green vapor as it worked its way around the pit. Chapter 18. I crouched, watching this fighting machine closely, satisfying myself now for the first time that the hood did indeed contain a Martian. As the green flames lifted, I could see the oily gleam of his integument and the brightness of his eyes. That night, as I lurked in the scullery, I tried in vain to conceive some plan of escape, but afterwards, during the second day, I was able to consider my position with great clearness. My chief opportunity for escape lay in the possibility that the Martians might make the pit nothing more than a temporary encampment, or even if they kept it permanently, I thought perhaps they might not consider it necessary to continue to guard the area, thus providing me with an opportunity to escape. It was very late in the night, and the moon was shining brightly. The Martians had taken away the excavating machine. Save for a fighting machine that stood in the remoter bank of the pit, and a handling machine that was buried out of my sight in a corner of the pit immediately beneath my peephole, the place was deserted by them. Except for the pale glow from the handling machine and the bars and patches of white moonlight, the pit was in darkness. And except for the clinking of the handling machine, the area was quite still. Then I distinctly heard a booming exactly like the sound of great guns. I counted 6 distinct reports. Then, after a long interval, I heard 6 again. Then that was all. Several days passed, and still nothing happened. Chapter 19. At first, my mouth and throat were parched, and my strength ebbed sensibly. I sat about in the scullery's darkness, despondent and wretched. My mind ran on eating. I thought I had become deaf, for the noises of movement I had been accustomed to hear from the pit had ceased absolutely. I did not feel strong enough to crawl noiselessly to the peephole, or I would have gone there. On the 12th day, my throat was so painful that I took the chance of alarming the Martians. I attacked the creaking rainwater pump that stood by the sink. For my efforts, I received a couple of glassfuls of blackened and tainted rainwater. Despite its quality, it refreshed me greatly. I was also emboldened by the fact that no inquiring tentacle followed the noise of my pumping. On the 14th day, I went into the kitchen. I was surprised to find that the fronds of the red weed had grown right across the hole in the wall. For a long while I lay close to the peephole, not daring to move aside the red plants that obscured my view. At length, encouraged by the silence, I looked out. As I stared about me, I could scarcely believe my eyes. All the machinery was gone. Save for the big mound of grayish-blue powder in one corner, and certain bars of aluminum in another, the place was merely an empty circular pit in the sand. Slowly, I thrust myself out through the red weed and stood upon the mound of rubble. I could see in any direction save behind me to the north. I found neither Martians nor any sign of Martians. The pit dropped off sharply before my feet, but a little way along the rubbish afforded a practical slope to the summit of the ruins. My chance of escape had come. I began to tremble. I hesitated for some time. Then, in a gust of desperate resolution, with a heart that throbbed violently, I scrambled to the top of the mound in which I had been buried for so long. Chapter 20. For some time I stood tottering on the mound, in complete disregard of my safety. I had expected to see Sheen in ruins. Instead, I found about me the landscape of another planet, weird and lurid. Soon my dominant motive became the hunger of my long and dismal fast. In the direction away from the pit, I saw, beyond a red-covered wall, a patch of garden ground unburied. The density of the weed gave me a reassuring sense of hiding. The wall was some 6 feet high. When I attempted to clamber over it, I found I could not lift my feet to its crest, so I went along by the side of it until I came to a corner and a rockwork that enabled me to get to the top. There I tumbled into the garden I coveted. Here I found some young onions, a couple of gladiolus bulbs, and a quantity of immature carrots, all of which I secured. Scrambling over a ruined wall, I went on my way toward Kew. Some way farther, in a grassy place, I found a group of mushrooms which also I devoured. Then I came upon a brown sheet of flowing shallow water, where meadows had once been. At Putney, the bridge was almost lost in a tangle of weeds. The same was true at Richmond. As the water from the Thames spread, the weed followed them, until the ruined villas of the Thames Valley were for a time lost in this red swamp. In the end, the red weed succumbed almost as quickly as it had spread. A cankering disease, probably caused by the action of certain bacteria, presently seized upon it. By action of natural selection, all terrestrial plants have acquired the power to resist certain bacterial diseases. That being true, they never succumb without a severe struggle. The red weed, however, rotted like a thing already dead. The fronds became bleached, then shriveled and brittle. My first act upon coming to this water was to slake my thirst. Presently I got out of this spate and made my way to the hill that leads up toward Roehampton and comes out on Putney Common. Here patches of ground exhibited the devastation that might have been caused by a cyclone. In a few score yards I came upon perfectly undisturbed spaces, houses with their blinds trimly drawn and doors closed, as if their inhabitants slept within. The red weed was less abundant. I hunted for food among the trees, finding nothing, and I also raided a couple of silent houses, but they had already been broken into and ransacked. Finally, because I was too fatigued to push on, I rested for the remainder of the daylight in a shrubbery. During all this time, I saw no human beings. I also saw no signs of the Martians. After sunset, I struggled on along the road toward Putney, where I think the heat ray must have been used for some reason. In the garden beyond Roehampton, I found a quantity of immature potatoes, sufficient to stay my hunger. From this garden I could look down upon Putney and the river. The view at dusk was one that was singularly desolate. Blackened trees, blackened, desolate ruins, and down the hill the sheets of the flooded river were red-tinged with the weed. Over all there was absolute, utter silence. For a time I believed that humankind had been swept out of existence, and that I stood there alone, the last man left alive on earth. The Martians, I thought, had gone on and left the country desolate as they continued their search elsewhere. Perhaps even now they were destroying Berlin or Paris, or it might be that they had gone northward. Chapter 21. I spent that night in an inn. There I found a rat-gnawed crust and 2 tins of pineapple. The place had been already searched and emptied. The morning was bright and fine, and the eastern sky glowed pink, fretted with little golden clouds. My movements were languid, my plans completely vague. My intense loneliness now became razor-sharp. From the corner I went, under cover of a thicket of trees and bushes, to the edge of Wimbledon Common. That dark expanse was lit in patches by yellow gorse and broom. There was no red weed to be seen. As I prowled, the sun rose, flooding the countryside with light and vitality. I went down the hill by High Street. There I crossed the bridge to Fulham. The red weed tumbled about in great volume at that time, nearly choking off the bridge roadway entirely. Even so, its fronds were already beginning to develop whitened patches. The spreading disease would presently remove the weed swiftly. Black dust lay along the roadway from the bridge onward. The streets were horribly quiet. I found food, sour, hard, and moldy, in the town's baker's shop. Some way toward Walham Green, the streets became clear of black powder. I passed a white terrace of houses that were on fire. Going on toward Brompton, the streets were quiet again. The farther I penetrated into London, the profounder grew the stillness. In South Kensington, the streets were clear of the dead and of black powder. It was near South Kensington that I first heard the howling. It was a sobbing alternation of 2 notes. Oola, 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 oola. I stopped, staring toward Kensington Gardens, wondering at this strange remote wailing. It seemed as if that mighty desert of houses had found a voice to express their collective fear and solitude. Oola, 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 wailed that superhuman note, great waves of sound sweeping down the broad sunlit roadway. I turned northwards toward the iron gates of Hyde Park. All the large mansions on either side of the road stood empty and still. My footsteps echoed against the sides of those same houses, the voice growing steadily stronger and stronger. Oola, 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 cried the voice. The desolate cry worked upon my mind until at last I felt intensely weary, footsore, and now again hungry and thirsty. I came into Oxford Street by the Marble Arch. Here again I saw more black powder and several bodies. Growing thirsty from the heat of my long walk, I managed to break into a public house to get food and drink. Weary after eating, I slept on a black horsehair sofa I found in the parlor. I awoke to find that dismal howling still in my ears. It was now dusk. After I had routed out some biscuits and a cheese in the bar, I wandered on through the silent residential squares, coming out at last upon Regent's Park. As I emerged from the top of Baker Street, I saw far away over the trees, in the clearness of the sunset, the hood of the Martian giant from which this howling was being emitted. Somehow I was not terrified. I watched him for some time, but he did not move. I tried to formulate a plan of action. That perpetual sound of "oola, oola, oola, oola" confused my mind. I turned back away from the park and struck into Park Road. I went along under the shelter of the terraces to where I could view this howling Martian from the direction of St. John's Wood. I came upon the wrecked handling machine halfway to St. John's Wood station. At first I thought a house had fallen across the road. It was only as I clambered among the ruins that I saw with a start this mechanical Samson lying with its tentacles bent, smashed, and twisted among the ruins it had made. It appeared that it had driven blindly straight at the house only to be overwhelmed in its overthrow. Even though I wondered about all I had seen, I pushed on toward Primrose Hill. Far away, through a gap in the trees, I saw a second Martian, as motionless as the first, standing in the park toward the zoological gardens. He was silent. A little beyond the ruins about the smashed handling machine, I came upon the red weed again. As I crossed the bridge, the sound of "oola, oola, oola, oola" ceased. It was, as it were, cut off. The silence came like a thunderclap. All about me the red weed clamored among the ruins, writhing to get above me in the dimness. Night, the mother of fear and mystery, was coming upon me. Then suddenly a change occurred. It was the passing of something, I knew not what, and then a stillness that could literally be felt. Then there was nothing but this gaunt quiet. I turned down St. John's Wood Road and ran headlong from this unendurable stillness toward Kilburn. I hid from the night and the silence in a cabman's shelter. Before the dawn, my courage returned. While the stars were still in the sky, I turned once more toward Regent's Park. I missed my way among the trees, and presently saw in the half-light of early dawn the curve of Primrose Hill. On the summit, towering up to the fading stars, a third Martian stood erect and motionless like the others. I hurried through the redweed that choked St. Edmund's Terrace and emerged upon the grass before the rising of the sun. The thought that had flashed into my mind grew real. I felt a wild, trembling exultation as I ran up the hill toward the motionless monster. Out of the hood hung lank shreds of brown, at which the hungry birds pecked and tore. In another moment I had scrambled up the earthen rampart and stood upon its crest. The interior of the redoubt was below me. It was a mighty space with gigantic machines here and there within it. Scattered about, in some of their overturned war machines, lay in a row stark and silent. The Martians were dead. They had been slain by the putrefactive disease bacteria their systems were unprepared to battle. These germs of disease had taken a toll on humanity since the beginning of things, but by virtue of this natural selection of our kind, we have developed a resistance to them. There are no bacteria on Mars. Therefore, as soon as the invaders arrived and drank and fed on Earth, our microscopic allies began to work to accomplish their overthrow. By the toll of 1 billion deaths, man had bought his birthright of the earth, and it is his against all comers. Here and there they were scattered in that great gulf that they made, overtaken by a death that must have seemed to them as incomprehensible as any death could be. I stood staring into the pit, and my heart lightened gloriously, even as the rising sun struck the world. The pit was still in darkness. The mighty engines, so great and wonderful in their power and complexity, rose weird and vague and strange out of the shadows toward the light. At the sound of a cawing overhead, I looked up at the huge fighting machine that would fight no more forever. I looked at the tattered red shreds of flesh that dripped down upon the overturned seats on the summit of Primrose Hill. All about the pit, and saved as by a miracle from everlasting destruction, stretched the great mother of cities. Eastward, over the blackened ruins of the Albert Terrace and the splintered spire of the church, the sun blazed dazzlingly in a clear sky. Here and there, some facet in the great wilderness of roofs caught the light and glared with a white intensity. As I looked at this wide expanse of houses and factories and churches, silent and abandoned, as I thought of the multitudinous hopes and efforts, the innumerable hosts of lives that had gone to build this human reef, and of the swift and ruthless destruction that had hung over it all, when I realized that the shadow had been rolled back and that men might still live in the streets, and this dear vast dead city of mine would once more be alive and powerful, I felt a wave of emotion that was near akin to tears. The torment was over. Even that day the healing would begin. The survivors of the people scattered over the country, the thousands who had fled by sea, would begin to return. The pulse of life would beat again in the empty streets and pour across the vacant squares. Whatever destruction was done, the hand of the destroyer was now stayed. At the thought, I extended my hands toward the sky and began thanking God. In a year, thought I, in a year.